Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and foreign policy. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. As Israeli forces mass at Gaza's borders, there's a critical hostage situation involving over 150 individuals, including women, children, and the elderly, who have been seized by Hamas. Amid this crisis, a Canadian citizen is believed to be held hostage in Gaza, prompting her family to seek international support for her release under humanitarian law. Additionally, Canada has confirmed the deaths of two of its citizens in Israel, with another presumed dead, leading to preparations for assisted departures via the Canadian Armed Forces. In today's episode, we'll hear tactical, intelligence, political, and machinery of government perspectives on the crisis from former Defence Minister Peter MacKay, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister Denis Thompson, intelligence expert and adjunct professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, Taillon, and Major General Denis Thompson, who served 39 years in the Canadian Army, deploying on multiple operations at home and abroad. Each perspective will provide valuable insights into the complexities of the hostage situation, the challenges of coordinating rescue operations, and the broader implications of the crisis. This is the Expert Series. First, we'll turn to Major General Denis Thompson. Denis, welcome to the program, and thanks for joining us. I'm eager to hear your perspectives on the crisis unfolding in Gaza, so maybe we can start with a bit of a scene setter on what's occurring between Israel and Hamas to kick off the discussion we're going to embark on, and also why this is important for Canada.
I think the best way to approach this is to draw a parallel to what occurred in July and August of 2014, which was the last time that Israel launched an operation into the Gaza called Protective Edge. And at the time, I was serving as the force commander of the multinational force and observers in the Sinai, and my camp, where my headquarters was 18 kilometers from Gaza, and there were several observation posts, if you will, that were close by. The geography hasn't changed since then. I don't think that's a surprise. Gaza is extremely small, 40 kilometers north to south, 11 kilometers west to east at its widest point, which is on the border with Egypt. It's encircled by Israel, the Mediterranean Sea in the west, Israel to the north and east, and Egypt to the south. And there are three major urban conglomerations, which you're probably familiar with: Gaza City in the north, and then Khan Yunis and Rafah more to the south. And it's closed in. There's only three legal crossings, one between Gaza and Egypt, which is found at Rafah in the south, and that was covered by the multinational force and observers in my time. And it's generally only open to allow pilgrims from inside of Gaza to attend the Hajj. Otherwise, it's closed. And then the crossings into Israel are in the east at Kerem Shalom, which in my time was operated by contractors, but very serious contractors. It's an interesting, I went there a couple of times to see how it operated, and Aras in the north, which I haven't been to. And my understanding is, I don't know, it was clearly not happening now, but that there was some fishing permitted in the Mediterranean by the Palestinians until this latest punch-up, if you will. The land borders, as we have seen on film, are secured using this large sort of 3 to 4 meter high fence. But what I don't think people appreciate is that the fence, and it's the same fence incidentally that divides Israel from Egypt and parts of Jordan, is made out of rebar. So in other words, the fence has got 3/4 inch steel mesh. So you can't just cut through it with some wire cutters. It definitely takes heavy equipment. And it's covered by a forest of surveillance cameras, which are monitored 24/7 from a surveillance battalion set back from the fence. So that's just why I'm totally astonished, and I'll be interested to see how they actually got into Israel. But that's going to come in the fullness of time when they do an investigation. And then finally, what happened in Protective Edge, which could be instructive in terms of what's going to occur should the Israelis go into the Gaza Strip, is that at the end of the day, there were some 2,200 plus dead Palestinians, both Hamas fighters and civilians. 67 IDF soldiers were killed in action, and 6 civilians were killed inside of Israel. 5 Israelis and 1 poor person from Thailand, I believe it was. The Hamas and PIJ, or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, fired some 4,500 rockets and mortars into Israel, 735 of them being intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome. And that they don't need to intercept them all because, as you're probably aware, the Iron Dome only fires on targets, on missiles that are likely to hit built-up areas. So Many of the missiles landed in open terrain, and in some cases they fell short and inside of Gaza. But Israel's response was about 5,200 or so airstrikes inside of the Gaza Strip and the destruction of 30 plus tunnel complexes, which was really the point of their land incursion, and will be probably the same objective that they'll have this time around, although they may go deeper. The big difference is that this time, in the existence of hostages as human shields that didn't occur before. The number is unconfirmed, but somewhere in the vicinity of 100, and possibly as many as 3 Canadians, but that hasn't been confirmed yet either. So while Op Protective Edge and the IDF weren't required to penetrate deeply into built-up areas, they went strictly in there to destroy infrastructure. And I don't think that that's going to be an option this time because of the hostage situation. What does it mean to Canada? Well, there are Canadians that work for the United Nations and other NGOs inside of the Gaza Strip, so they're clearly going to be at risk. And as I mentioned, the 3 hostages. And we have a long history of helping Palestinians, at least on a humanitarian level. We're certainly no friends of Hamas. So we will be and have been dragged into this one way or the other.
Dennis, you brought up the hostage situation. There have been reports of Canadian hostages, I believe, but at this moment, I'm not certain if these reports have been confirmed. Nonetheless, what factors would you consider as a commander in a hostage rescue operation?
Well, the easiest way to explain this is to think about the movie Zero Dark 30 and the killing of Osama bin Laden, because without that way we can steer clear of anything that's classified. But the paradigm, if you will, that all soft forces use and that you can find online is called the F3EAD cycle. So that stands for find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, and disseminate. And it's the procedure that was used in Afghanistan, and it's the procedure that are used in most hostage rescue operations. So the front end of it, again, thinking of the movie Zero Dark 30, you need to find the bad guy, or in this case, you need to find the hostage. But we're not talking about a single hostage now. We're talking about hundreds of them. And that would mean that that you've got a big surveillance job, like an enormous, maybe even too large surveillance job on hand to actually find out where all of these hostages are, because they're going to be disseminated and distributed across the whole Gaza Strip. So that's difficult. It's done using signals intelligence and image intelligence and full motion video on drones, et cetera, which we can talk about later. By fix, it means that you need to keep an eye. Once you find whoever your target is, you need to keep an eye on them and ensure that they don't move while you're planning your operation or while you're launching your operation. The finish is the actual operation itself. And then when you're on the objective, you exploit everything that's of intelligence value. You scoop it up, and you might recall, again, hearkening back to the movie Zero Dark 30, the time taken by those SEAL team operatives to collect up as many hard drives and computers, et cetera, to take away so that they could be analyzed, which is the next phase, and then the information disseminated so they could continue their offensive operations against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in various parts of the world, whether it's Al-Qaeda in Maghreb or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, et cetera. So that's what a commander considers. He's got to tick those boxes, particularly the find and fix boxes, before he can launch the operation. And it reminds me of the Bosnian. So take away the movie, go to real life. The Bosnian Serb hostage crisis of 1995, when in May of 95 there were 370 UN peacekeepers and military observers taken hostage, including a number of Canadians, in an attempt to deter NATO from conducting further airstrikes against the Bosnian Serbs. And they were being used as human shields, which is precisely the tactic that I believe Hamas will use here. So without going into all the details, I can tell you that at the time, this was a multinational soft effort. So you have the same sort of multinational soft construct is going to be built inside of Israel to extract hostages by force if negotiations fail. And they're not likely to succeed because the situation is not akin to what went on in Bosnia, but it's going to demand a similar level of cooperation. The major differences being, of course, that Hamas is bloodthirsty and not the least bit shy about killing hostages. And of course, as we've already talked about, the terrain is much more complex inside of the Gaza Strip. So those are the things that the soft commanders, plural, because there will be a multinational effort to do this, we'll have to consider.
I'm wondering what you would consider mission success in terms of getting hostages out of harm's way and building on that. What kind of maybe specialized equipment or intelligence would be required to ensure mission success?
Well, first of all, mission success is always the same: 0 casualties. The hostages get out, and the hostage takers are either captured, which is usually the case in a domestic hostage rescue situation, or killed, which is probably the likely outcome in an insertion into Gaza. The fact that there are so many hostages and that they're dispersed, it's almost impossible to envision a 0 casualty situation. So what I think, and I heard today from the minister of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, that we're sending over negotiators, which is kind of interesting. But I think the first step is to at least negotiate out the most vulnerable people inside of the Gaza Strip. It doesn't do Hamas any good, but they may not see it this way because they're not using the same rule book that we are. It doesn't do them any good to have a bunch of young children and elderly people die on their watch needlessly. So they could release them, reducing the number to something a little bit more manageable, but it's still going to be tens, if not 100 hostages. So, yep, mission success is 0 casualties, but I don't see how that can come about. There's going to be some hard decisions having to be made by political leadership to accept losses amongst the hostages. So technology-wise, going back to that sort of find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, and disseminate cycle, in the find phase, you're clearly going to use everything at your disposal. And the Israelis have no shortage of coverage over the Gaza Strip, which again makes me wonder how this happened in the first place. But it'll be a combination of signals intelligence, and I don't think that Hamas is stupid enough to get up on the telephone now. But they certainly hoover up all of the signals that come out of the Gaza Strip, and they've got a fleet of airplanes that fly out of Israel and do racetracks over top of Gaza, even when there is no crisis, to keep an eye on these characters. They have analyzed all the image intelligence, and they're already striking multiple targets that they believe to be possible headquarters or launch sites for Hamas rockets. And closer to the event, in order to find the hostages, they'll use full motion video on drones of all types and aircraft, because oftentimes a air breathing, if you will, or an aircraft with human on board can accomplish more than a drone can. So all of that is going to be used. As I mentioned, the Israelis have a surveillance battalion that focuses almost exclusively on the Gaza Strip, and that isn't so far away. The divisional headquarters at Haim, which was attacked as well, is another center where they'll be collating this information. If they do find some hostages or all the hostages, then they need to fix them, and by that I mean they have to put the unblinking eye, as it's referred to, so that they know that the hostages are still there when they actually launch the operation. The problem with the unblinking eye is it's not hard, but it's the challenge is to make sure that whatever asset you're using to keep an eye on the bad guys doesn't trigger a move of the hostages, because it's so obvious, and that's not that difficult to achieve, and I'm sure the Israelis have got that figured out. Then in the finish, you're going to have to deliver your special forces operatives to the objective, and that, generally speaking, involves helicopters and a big air package to make sure that they're safe. So that's something again that the Israelis have in big quantities, but whether they can get to all the hostages simultaneously is another question. And then the rest of it is pretty much straightforward. You harvest the int-worthy stuff from the objective and you bring it back to your base, analyze it, and disseminate it so that it can be used in future hostage rescue missions. So the kit exists, and it exists in sufficient quantities. And certainly Canada has at least one special operations task force, has at least one, has the ability to launch at least one of these special operations task forces, and other nations have more capability. So you could see the conglomeration of multiple teams in the vicinity in order to figure out where the hostages are and to actually launch the mission.
Dennis, I have one more question for you. As a commander, what level of support would you need from the federal government or from a national government in a situation such as this?
Well, the thing about a hostage rescue, and I think any of these kinetic operations overseas that aren't part of a declared operation, is the federal government enacts what's called the Crown prerogative. In other words, the Prime Minister can order the Canadian forces to conduct military actions overseas, provided he's not breaking the law of armed conflict, which of course most commanders would refuse an order of that nature. And I don't doubt that that in this particular case, were there to be a serious multinational effort to go after the hostages, some of the hostages, all of the hostages simultaneously, that our government would approve of sending the appropriate forces overseas to conduct just such a mission. And of course, you can't do it without the full cooperation of the Israeli security and intelligence apparatus. And as you may know, they're not always part of the IDF. There's an IDF component, but there's Shin Bet, who's like the Israeli version of the FBI. They are responsible for Gaza. The borders around Israel are Shin Bet's responsibility, not Mossad. That's a mistake that people often make. And they have most of the human intelligence sources, but they also have other sources. So that's one organization that you would want to be cooperating with closely. And Yamam, which is their premier tier 1 SOF unit that does exactly this sort of thing in these circumstances. So those links, and I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school, already exist, and they'll be exercised to the greatest extent possible, if the Canadian government gives the green light and Israel invites them in.
Dennis, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate you joining me today. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Paul Taillon. Dr. Taillon has over 40 years of academic, intelligence, and military experience. Paul has operated as a practitioner and continues to provide advice as a theoretician in strategic leadership, national defense, terrorism, counterinsurgency, and security issues. Paul, thanks for joining me today. Happy to have you on. Would you be able to provide any analysis of maybe some of the specific factors or circumstances that allowed Hamas to execute such a significant military operation without detection by Israeli intelligence? And what might this reveal about the challenges intelligence agencies face in monitoring and countering military groups in these kinds of complex environments?
Well, first and foremost is security. Obviously, this operation was well orchestrated. It had an air portion, it had a sea portion, and a ground portion. Obviously, it had an intelligence portion because no one knew about it. It would appear. So there was a degree of preemption because they realized that communications for the Israelis become really important, particularly along Gaza and the West Bank. And they basically neutralized their ability to communicate. They took out their nodes. So that was rather important. And then, of course, you have a situation where it must have taken a number of months, if not years, to ensure a degree of security in relation to this mission, Josh. So I would suggest there was a lot of OPSEC, operational security, on behalf of Hamas. Also, there, as you're probably aware, there has been some issues relating to Hezbollah because they basically fired some missiles over, and there was a bit of a border incident just the other day. And of course, you have the Al-Quds force in Iran, all which this little triumvirate seems to be well placed to exchange information, tactics, techniques, and procedures, which if you take a look at how they operated, there's been a lot of training going on. So one of the issues was, first and foremost, isolate the frontier posts, which they did from communication side. They've kept a very low profile. They fed deception messages through their normal channels, which they knew would be intercepted probably by the Israeli intelligence services, the Mossad and Shin Bet, and as well as their military intelligence, and kept a very, very tight lid on the planning operation itself. And quite frankly, in our terms, they would have had a bigot list. So if you were informed of this, your name would be on a list. And so if there was any leakage, they would be found out. So I think you have to tip their hat for their operational planning. They did it under the nose of the Israelis, and indeed Western intelligence, because I have no doubt other countries are interested in that region, as well as I have no doubt that Iran had a finger in this, because they supplied millions of dollars to Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as provide weapons, et cetera, as we know through the tunnel situation. So at this point, the focus for Israel was on the West Bank, and they reinforced the West Bank, minimizing the activities. And because they thought that the Hamas leadership was focused on Gaza issues versus attacking Israel through a Maskirovka, a deception operation in comms, I think they did an extremely fine job. And I think you and I, as analysts of this, would be, hey, well done, guys. You know, from a purely professional point of view, it was shock and awe. And quite frankly, planning and execution was quite impressive.
When it comes to efforts to locate hostages, what can you tell me about the types of intelligence sources and methods typically employed? And can you elaborate maybe on some of the technical aspects of intelligence collection?
Well, I mean, if you go back in history, the targeting hostages is very complex. Particularly, it's one thing if you're in the desert, because the Americans had a lot of experience, isolated town, that sort of routine, or a safe house somewhere that the bad guys have secured somebody. They had an incident in 2014 relating to two Americans, I believe, in Yemen. And that was an operation that went south. It was bad planning. There's bad guys basically move people back and forth to ensure that they have no trace, minimize their communications, you know, any sort of sign of life issues, that sort of thing. So let's just take a look. Here you have Gaza. This morning, Josh, I read that we've got about 150. The Israelis have 150 hostages, some of which are American. We may have a Canadian or two. I have no idea. Nothing has seemed to have come out. There's been German. So now you've got a multinational issue and an issue relating to who's responsible. So you have that as a political issue. So you have that. Now you've got a area of Gaza which contains 2.3 million men, or people, I should say, population 2.3. It's very concentrated, very deep, large buildings, population intense. And if you go in an area like that, the requirement for intelligence has got to be exact, to the extent that which way the doors open. Okay. And also the bad guys will have routes in, routes out. They will understand where the threat is. They'll be monitoring those routes. They'll probably have issues relating to mines and demolitions there. Could very well be. Not to mention, the last number I saw, and this is going back about 5, 6, 7 years, Hamas and others have built over 1,800 miles of tunnels. Now, these are impressive tunnels. They're going down to, in one case, 130 to 250 feet. You know, so there's a high degree of engineering in this. They're lit, and that becomes problematic because you can hide people there. No way to access that otherwise through the ends there. And you have a situation where if you go in a conventional military operation, you're going to also have to be sweeping underneath. And it's very difficult for communications because normal communications will not work in tunnels. So you have to be essentially carrying wire to communicate with the surface. So it is a major issue. And that's one of the reasons why in the West, MOUT operations, military operations in urban terrain, or FIBUA, fighting in built-up areas, has become a real big study. They're looking back through history and then all the way up to present, essentially recent history, such as Fallujah and that sort of thing. So from an intelligence point of view, it poses some real challenges for human intelligence, imagery intelligence, geospatial, and unless you have sources that are close to the, as our British friends would say, have the eye on the sparrow, it becomes problematic. And as you can appreciate, if I have Josh, I'm not keeping him in one place. Josh is moving constantly with the security team to ensure. So how do you deal with that? Not to mention, let's say, according to today's number, 150. These are 150 variables. And they're not going to put them all in one place. They're going to distribute them because, as you are probably well aware, they have threatened to murder these individuals should the Israelis not warn of a bombing so people can evacuate. That means Hamas can evacuate and Hezbollah could evacuate respectively. So that it becomes a real issue. And then, of course, you then have to penetrate the Gaza area. And strangely enough, unless you look like the locals, walk and talk like the locals, it becomes very problematic. But you do need to have an intelligence capability on the ground to souse out, because with 150, 160 variables, i.e. Hostages, human behavior, you may have a leak. And that leak may show to 1 or 2 people. And that time period that you're looking for them is highly sensitive. So yeah, there's some serious intel aspects to do that. And of course, as I related earlier, you have a lot of dual citizens, a lot of Americans. And for example, there's this young German Israeli girl named Shana Luke. She's 22, and she was thought to be dead, but now it turns out that she's been captured, according to the Palestinian authorities. And so now you have a jurisdictional issue: a Jewish citizen, a German citizen. So who rescues? And this becomes even more so in certain situations where you may have a third world organization as a counterterrorism force. And they say, oh, it's our jurisdiction. Ooh, okay. Do you really want to negotiate that? And we've had situations GSG-9 in Mogadishu, and where the Somalis wanted to do the rescue operation. Not a good idea. and especially with an ad hoc organization.
Paul, this has been a great discussion. I've enjoyed listening to your insights. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on anything we've discussed before we wrap up, or perhaps if there's anything you think is important for our audience to take away from this discussion.
And essentially in 1980, when the SAS conducted an operation called Nimrod and went into the essentially the Iranian embassy, that had been seized by a bunch of Arabistani terrorists. And first and foremost, the first thing is that there was a complete coordination between MI5, MI6, GCHQ, everybody, and special forces and the police. They basically encountered, they created Cobra, which was there, the Cabinet Office briefing room, where Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Minister of Defense, and the Chief of the Military, plus probably a representative from the Hostage Rescue Organization from the SAS, got together. And once they found out it was a bona fide situation, they got into a dual track strategy. One, negotiate, while secondly, preparing on parallel a hostage rescue. So time is of the essence. So I think from that point of view, you had an extremely well-honed, well-trained, highly motivated counterterrorism force, backed by sound intelligence, backed by a government that understood the jurisdictional issues and the handover. Because at one point, the police had to hand over to the SAS, which was written on a piece of paper. That scrap of paper is now in the SAS headquarters in Hereford in the officers' mess. It was handed over to, at that time, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Rose, who commanded 22 SAS at the time, from the police chief. So it was practiced, well-honed, and provided by the latest intelligence. So I think those are some of the things that we can reflect upon. When you have a hostage situation, it's important to have it rehearsed. Okay, governments talk about, we have essentially a Cobra, or we have a national security team that comes in. It's got to be practiced. You know, as we saw in 9/11, one of the challenges was an aircraft was coming over. Do you shoot it down or you do not? I mean, those are serious issues, and our politicians and bureaucrats have got to be practiced and studied in this. And so I think the aspect of having maybe a historical study on this, and then contemporary, and then also, you know, your rehearsal aspect becomes really important. Because in hostage negotiation, which they'll come, I have no doubt, at some point, because there's no way you're going to be able to extricate 150, 160 hostages all at once. And if they know you're coming, they will kill the hostages. This is Hamas, all right? So I think this is going to be a highly complex operation. There's not only national interests here, particularly domestically, because at least from the feedback I'm getting, there's a lot of Israeli citizens that feel that they were left in the dark and were abandoned by their government. There's going to be a very, very serious review in the wake of all this, as happened in 73.
Thanks so much, Dr. Taillon. Next, we'll be speaking with the Right Honorable Peter MacKay, former Minister of National Defense. Mr. MacKay, thanks for joining the CDA Institute today. It's both a privilege and an honor to have you on the program. We've been speaking with various experts, NSA, tactical intelligence, to garner their perspectives on some of the challenges involved in addressing a hostage situation. So naturally, your extensive experience, I think, will really add to this discussion. I'd like to start by asking what you would look for in a briefing in terms of intelligence in a crisis.
Question, Josh. And I mean, you look for different things. escalations in certain signals and human intelligence sometimes will tip you off, even if you don't have the actual communications. If you see an uptick in communications, clearly, I think it's come to light that Iran was very active on this file. And in retrospect, and of course, it's very easy in retrospect to say this, but there were certain tip-offs and comments that were being made, even at the highest levels, by the Ayatollah and the IRI, that they were planning something. And, you know, Iran has been, of course, using proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah for a very long time. But Israel, to say the least, is at the pinnacle of intelligence gathering, interpretation, and I think that's going to be one of the things that people will look back on and say, why didn't they pick up on this and see that this was coming? But it was shocking, to say the least, and barbaric, and the amount of inhuman treatment of Israelis is still stunning. Even in a world where we've seen such brutality in places like Ukraine and other conflicts, this one is really rising to the top.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. MacKay. Diving a little deeper here, I'm wondering which ministers are typically involved in the decision-making process in an event such as this, and how does the senior political leadership liaise typically with the CAF?
Yeah, of course, foreign affairs is very much at the pointy end, public safety in some cases, and then the Department of National Defense. The Harper government had a national security cabinet committee, if you will, and that security cabinet would meet fairly regularly, but on an as-needed basis. I mean, we were in the midst of Afghanistan, and that called for regular consultations among the cabinet participants and the Prime Minister. And the sharing of information with the CAF would often happen in that context. You know, we would meet with the Chief of Defense Staff. We would also have, of course, representatives of CSIS. Sometimes Communication Security Establishment, CSE, would be part of that, and then the Prime Minister's clerk and National Security Advisor would very much be part of those discussions. And so I would expect that there was something similar, or I would hope that there was something similar set up. I note that Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, is in the region, and obviously leaning in and being very proactive on Americans that have been taken hostage or who are in need of consular assistance in the region. And so, you know, one would hope that we're going to see similar actions happening for Canada.
So we have the situation potentially where there are Canadian hostages. So when lives are potentially on the line in a situation like this, Canadian lives, from your perspective or experience, what would you say are the necessary criteria to determine a go or a no-go operation?
Well, gosh, we're treading a little bit close to the line in terms of some of those operational considerations. But, you know, I can harken back to a couple of situations where we had Canadians taken hostage in jeopardy. The Fowler and Gay case, which you may be familiar with. And there were obviously a lot of preparations being made for certain rescue attempts. I'll leave it at that involve our JTF-2, our CSOR Special Forces. Also, we work very closely with our closest allies, both in intelligence gathering, but sometimes in these rescue operations. So Canada has a very good working relationship with those Five Eyes and you know, UK, US, Australia, sometimes New Zealand, depending on the region. And it also very much, again, depending on the region and the government's support on the ground is a big consideration when you embark on such an effort. This situation is unique in many ways and complicated. Canadians taken out of Israel and into Palestinian territory. Of course, we're talking about Hamas being the functioning government, if I can call them that, there's really no ability to have meaningful high-level discussions in a way with a terrorist organization. The long-standing position has been you can't negotiate with terrorism, you can't enter into prisoner exchanges with terrorist organizations. That applies to Hezbollah as well. And although they are yet to be fully listed in Iran, we have a similar situation where it makes it extremely complicated to try to extract Canadians or enter into any kind of meaningful discussion to secure their release.
My last question for you, Mr. MacKay. I'm wondering, from the ministerial level, what would you say are maybe some of the chief concerns or considerations in coordinating something like the extraction of hostages?
Yeah, I mean, what I just spoke of, Josh, is about coordinating with allies primarily, and depending on the region and the government being able to work ideally with people who are on the ground and their security forces to help facilitate an extraction. Extractions are high risk, to say the least. They often involve some very, very unique skill sets that we are fortunate to have in JTF2 and our special forces. But it is something that you really need massive planning and input from the military, from the leadership, the commanders themselves to embark on. And it requires a very, very deft plan to carry out, especially when you have to stretch those supply lines across sometimes the entire globe to get to the region, and then to embark upon what can be, a real tightrope to get somebody out of custody and out of that situation, because clearly the threat of death or injury is heightened, to say the least, and that's the last thing you want to do. But you can't give in to that terrorist blackmail at the same time.
Well, Mr. MacKay, you've added a lot of valuable context to the discussion we're creating here around this situation unfolding with Hamas and Israel. Just wondering, before we wrap things up here, if you have any final thoughts on any of the topics we've discussed, or if there's something we missed maybe, or if you think there's something particularly important that our audience or listeners should hear or take away from this discussion.
Well, thanks, Josh. I mean, I would just express the concern that many have that this could spill over into the region and become a much broader conflict and a much broader humanitarian crisis. There's no question that there are a lot of external forces at play, including, as I mentioned, Iran, Hezbollah. I think there was a bit of a motive as far as trying to scuttle the deal and the negotiations that were taking place between Israel and Saudi. And so, the motives, again, are murky, the end game even more so. But the longer this goes on, obviously, the greater jeopardy that people are in, and that perhaps the greater chance there may be of this spilling into a much larger involved conflict with other countries in the region. And, certainly Canada is among all of the countries who have condemned the actions of Hamas. We need to continue to stand very strong with Israel and work with them in ways that are meaningful and demonstrate our support. I was a little concerned by the quintet statement that came out that didn't include Canada. And I note that some have remarked on this as well. It is a bit worrisome in terms of where Canada's standing is in the international world.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. To close out this week's episode, we'll discuss the role of the NSA in a crisis situation, such as the one currently unfolding, with former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister and CDA board member, Mr. Daniel Jean. Thanks for joining us today, Danielle. Pleasure to have you on the program. I'd like to dive right in, if that's okay. Your perspective as a former NSIA will really help frame some of the previous discussions we've already had about the ongoing Israeli-Hamas crisis. I'm curious primarily what the role of NSA is in all of this. So could you take me through your role as NSA and what it's like maybe in a crisis situation for those who are not familiar with the role?
So the role of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor very much mirrors what is the role of PCO. And when we talk about the private counsel office, it's got three key roles. One is independent advice to the prime minister. So it's the department that advises the prime minister. And that reflects the fact that the prime minister should get independent advice in the Westminster model, but even in other models, like in the US, you always have tensions between cabinet ministers and the White House. It's a normal way of making sure that the whole of government interests are being pursued as opposed to be just having one department. So the first role, independent advice to prime minister. Second role is to advise and support cabinet, the cabinet governance, which is very important. This is where the governance that brings the whole of government coherence, coordination on policies, on operations. And PCO plays a key role in supporting the whole cabinet, but also the various cabinet committees that exist. And then the third role, this is what we call the PCO convening role. And it's basically the role of a central agency in PCO in bringing interagency, departments, agencies together to focus on policy, to developing coherent and coordinated policies, or in the same way to bring coherence or coordination to operations. And the convener role is not one to direct, it's one that respects the various responsibilities of the departments. They're the ones who are responsible in terms of mandates, authorities, and actions, but it's just to make sure that there is a neutral convener that kind of brings these people together and influence this. So that's the role of PCO. That's very much what is the role of National Security Advisor, but on national security issues. So he provides independent advice to the prime ministers. With his team, he supports the various cabinet committees that are relevant on national security, provides advice to these committees, provides intelligence to these committees and their ministers. And then he or she plays this very important convening role in trying to drive coherence, coordination in the development of policies or in coordinating operations, including responding to crisis.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. I'm wondering if you could build off that a little. What specifically is your role in providing political decision makers with the right intelligence and information to make decisions when lives hang in the balance? And what are maybe some of the challenges involved there?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways of doing this. I mean, at the tactical level, looking at evolving situations on a daily basis, prime ministers and some of the key ministers receive from the department or from the PCO intelligence assessment and other partners, what I would describe more as tactical intelligence, right? Things that are evolving rapidly. They also receive regularly intelligence products that are more assessment products. And these usually will have benefited from interdepartmental conversations. There is a governance of senior officials, deputy ministers, committees that have various responsibilities. One of them is on intelligence, and this is where the most longer-term assessment situations are being reviewed, very much in kind of a peer review things, improve, and at some point disseminated to prime minister's office, to various ministers, and they will also serve to brief cabinet committees, relevant cabinet committees if required. So there is different ways and channels to provide different intelligence products, some of them more on the strategic side, like intelligence assessment, some of them more in terms of the evolution of a situation, so more tactical, some of that happen on the daily. If a situation is such that you want to go beyond just the intelligence, but you also don't bring more analysis, you may actually do a note to the prime minister, or you may do an oral brief to the prime minister where you're going to actually bring both the intelligence, but also bring some of the so what questions that come with this intelligence issue.
Well, thank you again for that, Daniel. I'm also wondering what the NSA's role or what your role would have been in interacting with CDS in a crisis.
So when there is a crisis, normally the relevant senior officials, so if it's a military, if it's got a military dimension, yes, probably the CDS and probably going to be global affairs, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there might be others. Initially, they may connect with the NSA, or the NSA may connect with them to talk about the situation. But actually, if it's a very major crisis, like what's just happened in the last couple of days, there is a Deputy Minister's Coordination Committee called DMOC. that can be called upon in 15 minutes. And DMOC has been very much established to, on a weekly basis, it looks at regular operations, but it can also be called upon in a crisis to make sure that in a matter of less than probably a half hour, you are able to establish the facts that are known, based on information facts, but also be based on some intelligence. And then you look at reliability. You look at the gaps of information. What is the information that we don't have that would help us in looking at how we respond to this crisis or this incident? You look at what actions have been taken or should be taken, what should be the roles and responsibilities. That interagency coordination is very important. And you look at what are the advice that you're going to provide the Prime Minister, ministers, advice that you may bring to cabinet committees. In the case of a crisis, normally the incident response group will be the relevant cabinet committee. And then you also look at what you're going to communicate, what you're going to communicate internally, what you're going to communicate externally to the public. So you asked me about question about the CDS. If it's a major crisis, DMOC has all the senior leaders at the table, the CDS, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the RCMP Commissioner, the CSIS Director, the Chief CSC, they are all at the table. And the interactions will be driven with the template that I'm just saying on who has information, who's the relevant players, and everybody is in, unless it's very, very sensitive intelligence, everybody will know what is happening. But at the same time, the people that can actually play a role, have a role to play in that situation will be the ones that are more active. And as I said, this is a situation that is really based on incident response templates. And it's not to have we have a policy gap here. But you identify when you're looking at a response, if you have a policy gap, you'll put it in the parking lot. This is something that you look at later on, but that's not the time to do this. It's really driven by making sure that you have the best possible information. You know what your gaps are information, what are the action, and who's on first base, who's on second base.
Well, Daniel, thanks for providing your answers to these questions. I think it'll be really useful framing for the overall discussion we're having. Appreciate your time. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask you, do you think there's anything important we missed or didn't talk about here? Or do you think there's something you'd like to reiterate or that you think is important for the public or listeners to understand about all of this?
I would say that my experience, and I've dealt with crisis all my life. I've served in Haiti. I was there during several coups. I was in Hong Kong doing Tiananmen Square. I've lived the Lebanese evacuation. I was in NSIA. I was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs when we had a number of major terrorist accidents, natural disasters, all that. Most of the time, the information that comes out early on is inaccurate. And this is the biggest challenge for officials, because not only they're trying to establish the facts and come up with the right actions and guidance, but they're fighting inaccurate information that is being reported on because nobody really knows what has happened. And that is always the risk in these situations. And we see it with some of the reports we've seen early on, or we see it with some of the suggestions, like you saw some suggestions in the media over the weekend that people at the embassy and all that were not focused on the consular response, that something like that is required. Well, I've been in many of these crises to know that probably they've been working around the clock. In fact, I've spoken to some people this week, and that's certainly what is happening. But the challenge in this situation is the isolated anecdote suddenly becomes the common understanding of the situation. And that's what senior officials has to fight for. And it's unfortunate because it becomes distractions, right? What you want to have is you want to make sure that you are focused on bringing people to safety. Our people, from a consular perspective, if, as is being reported, we have hostages, this is a very complex situation. It's going to require a lot of work with other countries, but making sure we work with these allies and we try to bring these people. And of course, Israel is going to have a major role to play in this, that we can bring these people to safety. So this is the biggest challenge, because most of the time what happens is you're fighting inaccurate information, and that becomes a major distraction, and it's not focusing us on the right thing, which is one of the reasons, if you look at Israel in this situation, right? They had a major debate nationally on some of the things that their government were, but suddenly they are at war. They're convening together, they stick together, they want to get to the solution, they're even establishing a war cabinet. That's what you need when you have an incident. It's not time to have a public debate on should we do this or should we do that. We should be collectively galvanized in trying to bring our people to safety.
Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to having you on in the future. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.